At 72, George Turner was a man of quiet routines, living off a modest pension. But one fateful day, he packed his bags and traveled to Las Vegas. With every cent of his savings in hand, George stepped into a dazzling casino, determined to experience life's thrill one last time. As the roulette wheels spun and slot machines chimed, his world began to unravel. What he didn't realize was that this reckless gamble would lead to an unexpected twist of fate, one that would leave everyone in tears. George Turner's mornings always began the same way. A quiet hum from the coffee machine filled his modest kitchen as he carefully stirred sugar into his steaming cup. His aging hands trembled slightly, a reminder of the years that had slipped by. The house, once filled with laughter and chaos, now echoed with silence. The absence of his late wife, Mary, weighed heavily on him. She had been gone for 5 years, but George still caught himself turning to share a thought with her, only to find the space beside him empty. At 72, George's life was one of predictable routines. He lived in the same house they'd bought when their daughter, Emma, was born. The pension he received each month was just enough to keep the lights on and food on the table, but there was no room for luxuries. Not that George wanted any. His days of yearning for adventure seemed long gone. Yet, deep down, an unsettling restlessness had taken root. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that he had merely existed rather than truly lived. One evening, as he sifted through an old box of keepsakes, George stumbled upon a photograph. It was a picture of him and Mary standing in front of a Las Vegas casino on their honeymoon. They looked so young, full of promise, with the world at their feet. That memory struck him like lightning. "What happened to that man?" George muttered to himself. The realization was bitter. Life had passed him by, and he had done nothing extraordinary. That night, George made a decision. He would take his modest savings, every penny of it, and gamble it all in Las Vegas. The idea was reckless, absurd even, but it filled him with an exhilaration he hadn't felt in years. If nothing else, it would be a final hurrah, a way to defy the monotony that had consumed him. The next morning, George drafted a letter to Emma. It was brief, cryptic even. "Emma, I've decided to take a trip. Please don't worry about me. I need to do this for myself. All my love, Dad." He folded the letter and left it on the kitchen table. His heart ached as he glanced around the house one last time. Memories of Emma growing up here, Mary's laughter ringing through the halls, it all felt so distant now. He knew Emma would be furious when she found the letter, but he hoped, in time, she would understand. Packing was quick. George didn't own much, and he didn't need much. He threw a few shirts, pants, and his best pair of shoes into a battered suitcase. At the last moment, he tucked the photograph of him and Mary into his jacket pocket. It was his talisman, a reminder of the man he used to be. The bus ride to the airport was uneventful, giving George plenty of time to second-guess his decision. What if he lost everything? What if this trip was nothing more than a foolish whim? But then he reminded himself of the alternative, another year of solitude, waiting for life to end. He couldn't bear it. When the plane touched down in Las Vegas, George's heart raced. The city was a sensory overload, flashing lights, the constant clinking of slot machines, and the hum of excitement in the air. For the first time in years, George felt alive. He checked into a modest hotel just off the Strip and stared out the window at the neon jungle below. This was it. He had crossed the threshold, leaving behind the man who lived in quiet despair. That night, as George lay in bed, he thought about Mary. She had always been the adventurous one, the one who dreamed of far-off places and bold risks. He imagined her smiling at his decision, even if it was a bit foolish. "This one's for you, Mary," he whispered before closing his eyes. Tomorrow he would walk into a casino with his entire pension in hand. What would happen next was anyone's guess. The following morning, George woke early. Despite the restless night, his nerves were steeled with determination. Pulling open the heavy drapes in his small hotel room, He was met with the view of Las Vegas in full splendor. The sunlit city glimmered with remnants of last night's energy. The streets were alive with tourists, performers, and street vendors, a stark contrast to the quiet corners of life George was used to. He took a deep breath, feeling a small surge of anticipation. After a quick breakfast in the hotel cafe, George stood at the entrance of his first casino, the Golden Mirage. The revolving doors welcomed him into a world that was both thrilling and intimidating. The air smelled faintly of cigars and freshly polished leather, mixed with the hum of machines and occasional bursts of cheers. He took a moment to absorb his surroundings. Rows upon rows of slot machines sparkled, their screens adorned with dancing fruits, bells, and wild symbols. Dealers at blackjack and poker tables shuffled cards with a practiced finesse, while roulette wheels spun hypnotically, their little balls clattering with promise. George's first step inside felt surreal. It wasn't just a building. It was a sensory overload designed to captivate. He approached the cashier with his hands trembling slightly, withdrawing every dollar he had brought. The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow at the sum but handed over the stack of chips without a word. George stuffed them into his pocket, his pulse quickening with each passing second. Wandering the casino floor, he wondered where to begin. A slot machine with golden tigers caught his eye, its blinking lights beckoning. With a deep breath, he fed in his first few chips and pulled the lever. The machine whirred to life, the wheels spinning faster and faster before finally landing. A scatter of matching symbols lit up the screen, and a small handful of chips clattered out. His first win! It wasn't much, but the thrill was undeniable. The small victory gave him confidence, and George moved on to other games, each one more exhilarating than the last. He tried his hand at roulette, betting on red for the sheer thrill of it. When the ball landed on his chosen color, he nearly shouted with glee. By midday, he had doubled his initial stack. He even allowed himself a celebratory drink at the bar, a dry martini, the way Mary used to like it. But as the hours wore on, George noticed the darker side of the casino's charm. The once cheerful crowd around him began to thin, replaced by tired faces staring blankly at their losses. He saw a man in his 30s arguing with a dealer, his desperation evident. A woman sobbed quietly at a slot machine, her makeup streaked from tears. For every winner, there were a dozen losers. The realization made George pause. Was he any different from these people? Was he chasing a high that would inevitably leave him empty-handed? Shaking off the thought, George returned to the blackjack table. The dealer's sharp gaze met his as she dealt him 2 cards, an 8 and a 7. He hesitated before signaling to stay. The dealer flipped her cards, a king and a 5. George's heart leapt. He had won again. The chips piled in front of him were larger now, the stack teetering precariously. Yet, as the night wore on, his luck began to waver. By the time the clock struck midnight, George was back where he started. His winnings had dwindled, and fatigue was setting in. He stepped away from the tables, his legs unsteady. The casino's once dazzling lights now felt oppressive, the noise overwhelming. He made his way to a quiet corner and sank into a plush chair, gripping the photograph of Mary in his pocket for reassurance. "What am I doing?" he whispered to himself. His heart ached with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to leave, to hold on to what little he had left. But another part, the part that had brought him here, urged him to press on. This wasn't just about money, it was about feeling alive, about reclaiming something he had lost long ago. As he rose to his feet, George made a promise. Tomorrow he would return to the casino with a clearer mind and a bolder strategy. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The night sky over Vegas twinkled as he walked back to his hotel, the city's energy pulsing through him. For better or worse, his journey had only just begun. The morning sun barely crept over the skyline as George prepared for his second day at the casino. He had barely slept, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind. Though he had broken even, the rush of gambling lingered, urging him to try again. This time, he convinced himself he would be smarter, more calculated. Today, he wouldn't just play for fun, he would play to win. After a quick breakfast and a strong cup of coffee, George returned to the Golden Mirage. The atmosphere felt different during the day, less chaotic, but no less electric. The players seemed more focused, their eyes sharp with determination. George joined them, his chest tightening with anticipation as he clutched his dwindling stack of chips. His first stop was the roulette table, where he carefully studied the wheel's pattern. He placed a modest bet on black, holding his breath as the ball spun. It landed on red, and his chips disappeared. George frowned but shrugged it off. It was just one loss, he told himself. He placed another bet, this time on odd numbers. The ball spun again and landed on his choice. Chips clattered into his pile, and George felt a flicker of hope. The hours passed, and George found himself riding an incredible streak. At the blackjack table, his cards seemed almost blessed. Hand after hand, he won with calculated moves and a touch of luck. His stack of chips grew larger with each victory, drawing the attention of other players. A small crowd gathered behind him, whispering in awe as he confidently signaled to hit or stay. "You've got a knack for this, old-timer," said a young man in a leather jacket, watching George win yet another hand. George smiled, but said nothing. Inside, he felt a mix of pride and disbelief. Was it really luck, or was this some kind of cosmic reward for all the years he had spent playing it safe? Whatever it was, he wasn't about to question it. He moved to the craps table next, where the crowd cheered as he rolled number after number with uncanny precision. By mid-afternoon, George's modest savings had turned into a small fortune. The stack of chips in front of him was so large that a casino attendant had to bring a separate tray to hold them all. Other players patted him on the back, and a few even offered to buy him drinks. For the first time in years, George felt like a star. The attention was intoxicating, a far cry from the quiet anonymity of his life back home. But beneath the thrill, a small voice of caution began to whisper. It reminded him of the people he had seen the night before, the tearful woman at the slot machine, the desperate man at the blackjack table. He glanced around and noticed some of those same faces, still chasing their losses with weary determination. Would he become one of them if his luck ran out? Pushing the thought aside, George decided to take a break. He carried his chips to the cashier and exchanged a portion of them for cash, tucking the crisp bills into his jacket pocket. It felt surreal to hold that much money in his hands. For a fleeting moment, he considered leaving the casino altogether, walking away while he was ahead, but the pull of the tables was too strong. Returning to the blackjack table, George felt a shift in his confidence. His winning streak continued, but the stakes were higher now. He placed larger bets, emboldened by his earlier success. The dealer's expression remained stoic as she dealt him a pair of aces. George split them, doubling his bet, and the cards that followed brought him a double win. The crowd erupted in applause, and George couldn't help but grin. By the time the sun began to set, George had amassed more money than he had ever seen in his life. His heart raced with the possibilities. He could pay off his daughter Emma's student loans, fix up the old house, or even take that dream vacation he and Mary had always talked about. The thought brought tears to his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. There was no room for sentimentality here. As he prepared to leave for the night, George caught the eye of a man watching him from across the room. The man was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, and his gaze was piercing. He raised a glass in George's direction, a subtle but deliberate gesture. George hesitated, unsure what to make of it. Was it a simple acknowledgement of his success, or something more? Before he could decide, the man disappeared into the crowd. George left the casino with his winnings safely tucked away, his mind buzzing with plans for the future. Yet, as he walked back to his hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that his luck had put him on someone's radar, and that his journey was far from over. The following morning, George woke to a knock on his hotel door. It was room service delivering the breakfast he hadn't ordered. A gleaming tray with eggs, toast, and fresh orange juice sat waiting as a hotel staff member explained that his meal was courtesy of the house. Bewildered but amused, George tipped the server and sat down to eat, chalking it up to the casino's way of keeping big spenders happy. Yet the gesture felt oddly personal, as though someone were paying close attention to him. He brushed it off, eager to return to the casino. The adrenaline from his winnings the previous day hadn't worn off, and he couldn't wait to test his luck again. Today, however, felt different from the start. As George re-entered the golden mirage, the lights seemed harsher, the sounds louder. The tables that had brought him success now seemed daunting, even mocking. George decided to start small, heading to the roulette table with a cautious stack of chips. He bet on red, the same color that had brought him early victories. The ball spun, and his heart raced as it bounced unpredictably around the wheel. Black. His chips vanished. "Just bad luck," George muttered, trying to shake it off. He placed another bet, this time on even numbers. The ball spun again. Odd. Another loss. The sting of defeat started to creep in, but George refused to back down. He moved to the blackjack table, hoping to regain his confidence. The dealer greeted him with the same blank expression as always, but George felt an air of detachment he hadn't noticed before. The cards came fast and unforgiving, a 10 and a 6. He signaled to hit, only to be dealt a queen. Bust. The dealer collected his chips with practiced indifference. The losses began to pile up. Every win from the day before felt like a distant memory, washed away by the relentless tide of misfortune. George's hands shook as he placed bet after bet, each one more desperate than the last. He told himself it was just a phase, that his luck would turn around. But it didn't. Every spin, every deal, every roll seemed designed to strip him of his hard-earned fortune. By mid-afternoon, George was back to where he had started 2 days ago. No better, no worse. But the sting of losing what he had built weighed heavily on him. He felt the pull to walk away, to cut his losses and leave with the small amount he had left. Yet, something kept him rooted in place. The casino had a way of playing with his mind, convincing him that one more bet could change everything. Desperation began to cloud his judgment. He moved to the high-stakes poker table, where the players looked more like predators than gamblers. Their sharp suits and calculating eyes made George feel like an outsider, but he sat down anyway. The first few hands went well enough, and he began to feel a glimmer of hope. But then came the losses, steep and unrelenting. The room seemed to close in on him as his final chips were swept away by a man in dark sunglasses who barely glanced in George's direction. Defeated, George pushed back from the table and stumbled out of the room, his chest heavy with shame and regret. In the dim hallway leading to the exit, he slumped against the wall, trying to steady his breath. For the first time in years, he felt truly lost. The thrill that had driven him to Las Vegas now felt like a cruel joke. He had gambled not just his money, but his sense of self-worth, and he had lost it all. As he wandered back to his hotel room, his mind raced with questions. Why had he come here? Was it to honor Mary's adventurous spirit, or to prove something to himself? He felt like a fool, chasing dreams of grandeur only to find himself back at square one, or worse. That night, as George sat alone in his room, staring at the empty space where his winnings had once been, a knock came at his door. He hesitated before answering, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and curiosity. Standing in the doorway was a tall, well-dressed man with piercing eyes. It was the same man who had watched him the night before. "Mr. Turner," the man said smoothly, extending a hand. "My name is Victor. I think we need to talk." Victor exuded an air of authority as he stepped into George's hotel room. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, and the subtle aroma of an expensive cologne lingered in the air. George, still reeling from his losses, stared at the man warily. "Relax, Mr. Turner," Victor said with a calm smile, seating himself uninvited in the room's armchair. "I'm not here to collect debts or cause trouble. Quite the opposite, actually." George sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tinged with defeat. Victor leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I've been watching you, Mr. Turner. Your story caught my eye. A man of your age gambling away his entire pension in one of the most unforgiving places in the world. It's intriguing." George frowned. "Is that supposed to be a compliment? I don't see what's so fascinating about losing everything." Victor chuckled softly. "You see it as losing. I see it as an act of bravery, or desperation, perhaps. Either way, I believe you're a man willing to take risks when it counts, and that's precisely why I'm here." George raised an eyebrow. "What are you getting at?" Victor leaned back, studying George with sharp eyes. "I'm offering you a chance to win it all back, and then some. A high-stakes poker game, invitation only. It's happening tomorrow night in a private suite here at the Mirage. The buy-in is steep, but the rewards could be life-changing." George's heart sank. "I just told you I've lost everything. I couldn't buy in even if I wanted to." Victor smiled again as if anticipating the objection. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch, placing it on the table. "Consider this a loan. $10,000 in chips. If you win, you pay me back with a small percentage of your earnings. If you lose—" He trailed off, his smile fading slightly. "Well, let's just say we'll discuss that if it comes to it." The offer was both enticing and unsettling. George stared at the pouch, his mind racing. The idea of walking away from Vegas with nothing but regret gnawed at him, but the thought of owing a man like Victor made his stomach churn. "Why me?" George finally asked. "There are plenty of gamblers here who'd jump at a chance like this. Why go out of your way for a washed-up old man?" Victor's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Because I see potential in you, George. Most people who lose at the tables are broken by it. But you still have a spark. You're not ready to give up, and that makes you valuable." George hesitated, his fingers twitching against his knees. The logical part of him screamed to decline the offer, to walk away and salvage what little dignity he had left. But another part, the part that had brought him to Vegas in the first place, urged him to say yes. "What's the catch?" he asked cautiously. Victor's smile returned. "No catch, just a simple agreement. You win, you repay the loan and a small fee. You lose, and we'll work something out. I'm not in the business of ruining lives, George. I'm in the business of giving people opportunities." It was a carefully worded answer, but George was too tired and desperate to probe further. He reached for the pouch, the weight of it surprisingly heavy in his hand. His pulse quickened as he imagined sitting at a table with $10,000 in chips, facing opponents with even deeper pockets. "I'll think about it," George said, though he knew the decision had already been made. Victor rose, smoothing the lapels of his suit. "I'll have someone contact you tomorrow with the details. In the meantime, get some rest. You'll need a clear mind for what's ahead." As the door clicked shut behind him, George felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. He poured the contents of the pouch onto the bed, letting the chips spill out in a cascade of shimmering gold and silver. It was more money than he had ever handled at once, and the sight of it filled him with both hope and fear. He spent the rest of the night pacing the room, torn between excitement and doubt. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced, but so was the potential reward. For better or worse, this was his chance to rewrite the ending of his story. By dawn, George had made up his mind. Tomorrow he would sit at that table, and he would play for his life. The next evening, George stood outside the private suite Victor had directed him to, his palms slick with sweat. The door was guarded by two imposing men in dark suits, their expressions as unreadable as the high-stakes poker players waiting inside. With a curt nod, one of the guards opened the door, gesturing for George to enter. The room was nothing like the bustling casino floor. It was dimly lit, exuding an air of exclusivity and intimidation. A round poker table sat at the center, surrounded by well-dressed players whose faces betrayed no emotion. George felt out of place in his wrinkled shirt and worn shoes, but he forced himself to sit down. This was it, his chance to reclaim what he had lost. Victor was there, standing by the bar with a glass of amber liquid in hand. He nodded approvingly as George took his seat. "Good luck," he said, his voice smooth and confident. The game began with little fanfare. George's heart pounded as the dealer shuffled the deck with mechanical precision, the cards flying across the table in rapid succession. He glanced at his initial hand, a pair of tens. A decent start, but not enough to inspire confidence. He decided to play conservatively, folding early in the first round to observe the others. The players were a mix of personalities: a smug businessman with a gaudy watch, a woman with calculating eyes and an air of quiet menace, and an older man whose calm demeanor suggested decades of experience. George studied their moves, trying to piece together their strategies while concealing his own nervousness. As the night wore on, George found himself winning small hands and losing others. The stakes rose with each round, the piles of chips in front of the players fluctuating like the tides. He began to notice something strange about the game. It wasn't just about cards. The conversations around the table became increasingly personal, almost probing. "So, George," the woman across from him said during a break in the action, "what brought you to Vegas? Midlife crisis?" The question caught him off guard. "Something like that," he muttered, keeping his gaze on the table. "Must have been more than that," the older man chimed in. "A guy doesn't gamble his pension unless he's running from something, or chasing it." The words hit George like a blow. He felt exposed, as though the room's dim lighting couldn't hide the weight of his regrets. He thought of Mary, of the quiet years he had spent mourning her, of the life he had wasted in his small, empty house. The game resumed, but George's mind was clouded with memories. He barely noticed when he was dealt a pair of kings, a golden opportunity. The businessman raised the stakes aggressively, his smirk daring George to fold. But something in George stirred, a refusal to back down. He matched the bet, then raised it further. The final card was revealed: a king. George's heart leapt. A full house. He could hardly believe his luck as the chips were pushed toward him, his pile growing larger. The businessman scowled, muttering under his breath about beginner's luck. Victor watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. George caught his eye and saw a glimmer of approval. Or was it amusement? It was hard to tell. As the night progressed, the game became more intense. George continued to win, his stack of chips growing steadily, but with each victory, the questions became sharper. "What do you regret the most, George?" the woman asked during another lull. Her tone was casual, but her eyes bore into him. George hesitated. "I regret not being there for my daughter," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost myself after my wife died, and I shut her out." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Even the dealer paused before continuing the game. George felt a strange sense of relief in admitting the truth, as though shedding a burden he had carried for far too long. By the end of the night, George was one of the last players standing. His winnings were substantial, enough to change his life if he walked away now. But as he looked around the table, he realized that this game wasn't just about money. It was about confronting himself. The truths he had buried were laid bare, and he wasn't sure if he could handle what came next. As the final hand was dealt, George knew he was on the brink of something monumental. Whether it was victory or defeat, he would leave this room a changed man. The final hand of the night began, the tension at the table palpable. George's stack of chips was still substantial, though he had lost a few rounds as the pressure mounted. His opponents, now whittled down to the calculating woman and the older man, were just as determined to walk away as victors. The dealer shuffled the cards with meticulous precision, the sound of the deck slicing through the air echoing in the otherwise silent room. As the cards were dealt, George glanced at his hand, an ace and a jack of hearts, a promising start. The flop came, a 10, queen, and king of hearts. His heart raced. A royal flush was within reach. The stakes had never been higher, and George felt both exhilarated and terrified. "I'm all in," the woman declared, pushing her chips forward with a confident smirk. Her gaze flicked to George, daring him to follow. The older man hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I'm out," he said, folding his cards and leaning back in his chair. The room's focus shifted entirely to George. He looked down at his remaining chips, then at the woman's bold challenge. She could be bluffing, but if she wasn't, he risked losing everything. His hand shook slightly as he glanced at the cards on the table. The opportunity was too perfect, too rare. "I'm all in," George said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He pushed his chips forward, meeting her bet. The dealer revealed the turn, a 9 of clubs. George's heart pounded, one card away. "Last chance to back out," the woman said, her tone almost teasing. "Sure you're ready for this, old man?" George didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the dealer, who burned a card and placed the river face up. The king of hearts. A royal flush. George's jaw dropped, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had won. The woman's face twisted in disbelief as she revealed her cards. A full house, a strong hand, but no match for his. The dealer pushed the mountain of chips toward George, signaling his victory. The room erupted into scattered applause, but George barely heard it. His mind raced with possibilities. This money could change everything. He could rebuild his life, help his daughter, and finally make amends for all the years he had spent wallowing in grief. Victor approached, his expression unreadable. "Well done, Mr. Turner," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You played brilliantly." George nodded, still in shock. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. This is unbelievable." Victor placed a hand on George's shoulder, leaning in slightly. "Enjoy it. But remember, money doesn't solve everything. Sometimes the real victory is what you do with it." Those words echoed in George's mind as he collected his winnings and left the suite. The hallway felt surreal, as though he were walking through a dream. When he reached his hotel room, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the stacks of cash and chips in front of him. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. But along with it came a deep sense of responsibility. This was more than just money. It was a second chance, a chance to rebuild the bridges he had burned, to reconnect with the daughter he had neglected, and to live the life Mary had always dreamed of for them. That night, George didn't sleep. Instead, he penned a letter to Emma, pouring out his heart. He told her about his journey, his mistakes, and his newfound resolve. He promised to make things right, no matter what it took. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the window, George sealed the letter and tucked it into his pocket. Tomorrow, he would leave Las Vegas, not as a man defeated by his past, but as a man determined to face it. The bus ride back to George's small hometown was a stark contrast to the glitz and chaos of Las Vegas. The hum of the engine and the occasional chatter of passengers offered a soothing backdrop as George stared out the window, his thoughts miles away. His suitcase, once filled with simple clothes, now held the remnants of his winnings, a tangible reminder of the incredible highs and crushing lows he had experienced. In his jacket pocket was the letter he had written to Emma. He had rehearsed what he would say to her countless times, but as the miles rolled by, doubt began to creep in. Would she forgive him? Could he make her understand why he had left without explanation, risking everything in a place like Las Vegas? The thought of facing her anger made his chest tighten, but he knew he couldn't delay any longer. When the bus pulled into the station, George stepped off, his legs unsteady. The familiar streets of his town stretched before him, lined with modest homes and small businesses. Everything looked the same, yet George felt like a different man. The weight of his past regrets no longer crushed him. Instead, he carried a new sense of purpose. Emma's house was only a few blocks away. As he approached, George's heart pounded. The yard was neatly kept, the flowers in full bloom, a reflection of the life she had built without him. He hesitated at the front gate, gripping the handle tightly. Finally, he pushed it open and walked up the path, each step feeling heavier than the last. He knocked twice, his hand trembling. The door opened moments later, revealing Emma. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment George saw the little girl he had once known. But her expression quickly hardened. "Dad?" she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" George swallowed hard. "Emma, I know I have no right to show up like this, but I needed to see you. I needed to tell you how sorry I am." Emma folded her arms, leaning against the door frame. "Sorry for what, exactly? For disappearing? For shutting me out all these years?" "Yes," George said, his voice breaking. "I let my grief consume me. I didn't just lose your mother. I lost myself. And in doing so, I lost you too. I've spent every day regretting it." Emma's expression softened, though her guard was still up. "Why now? Why come back after all this time?" George reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. "Because I want to make things right. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try. This letter explains everything. Where I've been, what I've done. It's not much, but it's a start." Emma hesitated before taking the letter. She opened it and began to read, her eyes scanning the words he had poured his heart into. As she reached the end, tears welled up in her eyes. "Dad," she said softly, looking up at him. "I don't know if we can just pick up where we left off, but I'm willing to try." Relief flooded George's chest, and he nodded. "That's all I can ask for." Emma stepped aside, gesturing for him to come inside. As George entered her home, he felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. The walls were adorned with photos of Emma's life, her college graduation, her wedding, moments he had missed but could now learn about. Over the next few hours, they talked. George shared stories of his time in Las Vegas, carefully avoiding the darker details, and Emma opened up about her own struggles after her mother's death. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That night, as George lay on the guest bed Emma had prepared for him, he stared at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. For the first time in years, the future seemed brighter than the past. The weeks that followed George's reunion with Emma were filled with tentative steps toward rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't easy. Years of silence had left wounds that couldn't be healed overnight, but both were willing to try. George took small but meaningful actions, like fixing a broken fence in her yard and helping her with errands. In return, Emma shared pieces of her life, her struggles as a single mother, her successes at work, and her dreams for the future. One morning, over a quiet breakfast, George surprised Emma. "I've been thinking," he said, carefully stirring his coffee. "There's more I can do with this money than just fix the house or pay for things. I want to help others, people who've been where I was." Emma looked at him thoughtfully. "What do you mean, help others?" George set his cup down and met her gaze. "I don't want the money I won in Las Vegas to be just a reminder of a wild gamble. I want it to mean something. Maybe I could start by helping people in the community, those who've hit rock bottom and don't see a way out." Emma smiled softly. "That's a beautiful idea, Dad. I think Mom would have loved that." George felt a pang in his chest at the mention of Mary. It had been so long since he had thought about what she would have wanted. For the first time, he felt he was honoring her memory in a way that truly mattered. With Emma's encouragement, George began volunteering at the local shelter. At first, he simply donated part of his winnings, enough to fund new beds, fresh meals, and counseling programs. But over time, he became more involved. He spent his mornings serving breakfast, his afternoons repairing broken furniture, and his evenings talking to people who were struggling to find hope. One day, a young man named Marcus caught George's attention. Marcus, barely out of his teens, had been living on the streets after losing his job and his family's support. His eyes held the same despair George had once seen in his own reflection. "Why are you doing all this?" Marcus asked one evening as they worked together to organize donated clothes. "You don't look like someone who's had it rough." George chuckled. "Looks can be deceiving. I've made my share of mistakes, lost my way more times than I can count, but I got a second chance and now I'm trying to give others the same." Marcus stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time since they met, he smiled. "Maybe I can turn things around too," he said quietly. Over the months, George watched as Marcus got back on his feet, finding work and eventually a place to live. It wasn't just Marcus either. George's efforts sparked a ripple effect throughout the community. More volunteers joined the shelter, inspired by his dedication. Local businesses began donating supplies. The shelter flourished, becoming a beacon of hope for those who had almost given up. Emma often joined him at the shelter, bringing her young son along. George cherished those moments, seeing the bonds between them strengthen. One day, as they worked side by side, Emma turned to him. "You've done something incredible here, Dad," she said. "You've given so many people a reason to believe in themselves again." George shook his head modestly. "I just wanted to make up for the time I wasted. If I've helped even one person find their way, then it's worth it." By the time winter rolled around, George had become a familiar figure in the town, known not for his losses in life but for the way he had turned them into something meaningful. His name was etched into the hearts of the people he had helped, a legacy of kindness that would endure long after he was gone. That night, as he sat on Emma's porch, watching the stars twinkle in the clear winter sky, George thought of Mary. He imagined her smiling down at him, proud of the man he had become. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Years later, George sat quietly in his favorite armchair, the warmth of a quilt wrapped around his frail frame. The house was alive with the sounds of Emma's family bustling about, her laughter blending with the playful shouts of his grandchildren. The once empty halls that had echoed with silence now brimmed with life, a testament to the second chance he had been given. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the photograph on the small table beside him. It was an old picture of him and Mary, taken during their honeymoon in Las Vegas. She looked radiant, her smile as bright as the casino lights behind her. George smiled wistfully, brushing his thumb over the image. "Thinking about Mom again?" Emma's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. "Always," George replied, his voice soft. "I think she'd be happy with how things turned out. Don't you?" Emma crossed the room and placed the mug in his hands, sitting beside him. "She'd be proud, Dad. You turned everything around. You gave so much to the community, to us. You didn't just rebuild your life, you helped rebuild others, too." George nodded, though a wave of fatigue washed over him. His time was running short, and he knew it. But he wasn't afraid. In the years since his return from Las Vegas, he had found peace. The money he had won, once a symbol of recklessness, had become a tool for change. And the relationships he had mended, especially with Emma, had brought him more joy than he ever thought possible. That night, as the house settled into quiet, George reflected on his journey. He had gambled everything, his money, his pride, his heart, and somehow he had come out richer in ways that truly mattered. Life, he realized, wasn't about the cards you were dealt, but how you played them. Closing his eyes, George whispered, "Thank you, Mary," before drifting into a final, peaceful sleep.